Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're taking a deep dive into a book that, well, it put a huge, possibly controversial idea onto the global stage when it first arrived. Francis Fukuyama's The End of History.
Yeah. It's a title designed to make you stop and think, isn't it? And the central argument, as the book lays it out, is incredibly bold. It posits that liberal democracy might just be the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution, potentially the final form of human government.
And the reasoning behind it is really fascinating. The argument is that unlike systems before it, hereditary monarchy, fascism, communism, liberal democracy doesn't suffer from those fundamental sort of built-in contradictions that inevitably lead to their downfall.
Right.
Now, the book is really clear on this point. This doesn't mean existing liberal democracies are perfect or, have solved all their problems. The issues they face are framed more as incomplete implementation of the ideals of liberty and equality rather than like inherent flaws in the ideals themselves.
Exactly. It's a challenging idea, for sure, especially looking at the world today. But the book builds a powerful case by exploring why history might have a direction heading towards this particular point.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, unpacking that why. The book essentially traces two major forces or engines that it argues drive this historical process. First, there's the role of modern natural science and the economic development that stems from it, what the book calls the mechanism.
And second, drawing on thinkers like Hegel, there's the struggle for recognition. This is that basic human desire for dignity, for a sense of worth, often referred to by the Greek term thymos.
Okay, so our mission today is to journey through these ideas, exploring how these two engines work together, the evidence the book presents, and pulling out some of the most interesting points and examples along the way. Let's jump right in for setting the stage for why this idea of a universal history is even necessary to consider.
Well, the book begins by highlighting the traumatic backdrop of the 20th century. Think about it. Two world wars, the Holocaust, the rise of totalitarian regimes. That century severely shook the earlier sort of 19th century confidence in linear progress and, well, Western ideals. The sheer destructiveness of the European state system, it made the old distinctions between civilized and barbarian seem much less clear after events like the Nazi death camps.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't separate that from the intellectual crisis liberalism faced, right?
Yeah.
For much of the century, liberal democracy felt intellectually adrift, kind of struggling to articulate a strong defense against rival ideologies like fascism and communism, which offered such compelling, albeit terrifying alternative visions of society.
Exactly. That lack of intellectual consensus amplified the ideological stakes and the brutality of those conflicts. The book suggests there just wasn't a shared understanding of where humanity was headed, or if liberal democracy was truly a universal aspiration.
Which really underscores the search for some kind of powerful directional force in history. And that brings us to the first engine the book proposes, the mechanism of modern natural science. Okay, let's unpack this. The argument here is that modern science is fundamentally cumulative and, well, directional.
Think about it. Scientific knowledge builds upon itself. We don't like undiscovered gravity or antibiotics. This progress leads to a progressive conquest of nature.
Right, and the possibility of truly mastering nature rather than just living with it, that really took off in the 16th and 17th centuries with the development of the scientific method itself.
And crucially, this scientific progress is tightly linked to economic development. Scientific discoveries enable new technologies, new ways to organize labor, new tools which dramatically increase productivity.
The book points to the division of labor, made possible by technology and organization, or innovations in transportation and communication that allow for vast markets and economies of scale. And these science-driven economic changes seem to lead to surprisingly predictable social transformations, regardless of a society's prior structure. Urbanization happens because modern industry needs cities for labor and infrastructure.
Yeah.
Increased labor mobility is required because workers can't stay tied to traditional rural setups. They need to move where the jobs and skills are.
And these shifts inevitably undermine traditional social groups, tribes, clans, extended families. While those traditional ties might feel more humanly satisfying in some ways, they often struggle to compete with systems organized for maximum rational economic efficiency.
This line of reasoning strongly suggests that capitalism, in some form, becomes almost inevitable for countries aiming for advanced economic development. The book argues that socialist central planning was essentially an obstacle to wealth creation and technological progress because it lacks the competition, incentives, and flexibility needed for innovation and efficiency.
Right. And the stark contrast in economic performance between places like Taiwan and the PRC or North and South Korea is presented as pretty powerful empirical evidence for this.
Okay, but what about less developed countries? Does the argument hold there?
Well, the book explores that debate between dependency theory, which claimed global capitalism trapped poorer nations in supplying raw materials, and classical liberal trade theory, which argued that participating in open trade benefits all parties and lets latecomers import technology and grow.
And the evidence presented points towards a shift, doesn't it?
It does. Countries in Latin America like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, which had pursued these protectionist state-led strategies like nationalization and import substitution, well, they began shifting significantly towards economic liberalization, privatization, and free trade in the late 20th century.
Often after periods of crisis, right?
Yeah, exactly. Often following economic crises or authoritarian rule, Chile under Pinochet is even cited as an early, albeit, highly controversial example of how liberal economic reforms, even under a dictatorship, could lead to a healthier economy, at least in certain terms. The trend suggested a growing global consensus that the problem was maybe too little capitalism, not too much.
So the mechanism strongly propels societies towards market economics and modernization. But here's the big question the book poses. Does this necessarily lead to liberal democracy?
Ah, yes. There's a noted correlation. Economically developed countries tend to be stable democracies, as Lipset's work showed.
Right, the correlation is strong, but is it cause and effect? That's the key.
Well, the arguments for a link suggest advanced industrialization might favor democracy because democratic systems are maybe better equipped to mediate the complex, diverse interests in a developed society.
And education.
Universal education also has a leveling effect, promoting egalitarian ideas and social mobility, making rigid hierarchical systems harder to justify and maintain. Plus, you could argue a scientific and technical elite might naturally demand more freedom for inquiry and open debate.
The book uses South Africa's transformation as an interesting example here.
It does. The Afrikaner community, initially seen as very rural and insular, underwent massive urbanization and received higher education. This increased their contact with outside political norms and ideas, which the book suggests played a role in the eventual dismantling of apartheid. It changed their outlook.
But the book also acknowledges the critiques and, well, the counterexamples. Modernizing dictatorships like South Korea or Spain under Franco before democratization were highly successful at driving economic growth.
That's true. And there's even the argument, a slightly uncomfortable one perhaps, that authoritarian regimes might actually be more capable of implementing genuinely liberal economic policies.
How so?
Precisely because they aren't subject to the same political pressures and special interests found in democracies. The book mentions the U.S. struggling with budget deficits as a counterpoint.
And South Korea's transition to democracy, the book notes, initially led to things like higher labor costs and reduced competitiveness, right?
It did. So while the mechanism explains a powerful drive towards modernization and market economies, the direct, necessary link to political liberalism seems less certain based on economics alone.
Which is where the second engine comes in, a much more philosophical one, the struggle for recognition, or thymos.
Ah, yes. This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Thymos is described as this fundamental human desire for recognition, for dignity, for feeling valued, a profound contrast to the Anglo-Saxon liberal tradition, focusing purely on self-preservation, desire, and reason, like in Hobbes or Locke.
Who basically wanted to eliminate pride from politics, if I remember correctly.
Pretty much. They saw it as dangerous. But this book draws heavily on Hegel, particularly as interpreted by Kojève, to explain the idea that human self-consciousness actually originates in this terrifying battle to the death for pure prestige.
Wow, okay. Explain that a bit.
The concept is that by risking your life, not for survival or material gain, but for something seemingly trivial like honor, a medal, or even just respect, a trifle that signifies recognition, you prove your freedom from purely animal instinct and establish your essential humanity.
So it's about proving you're more than just an animal driven by survival.
Exactly. And this battle leads to a master-slave dynamic. But here's the crucial Hegelian twist. Neither the master nor the slave is ultimately satisfied.
Why not?
Well, the master gets recognition, but didn't really earn it through transforming nature, through labor, and remains dependent on the slave. The slave transforms the world through work, but isn't recognized as fully human by the master.
So there's this inherent dissatisfaction.
Yes, this deep dissatisfaction is what drives history forward, seeking a resolution.
And the book's central thesis here is that this fundamental human struggle for recognition finds its ultimate satisfying resolution in the universal and reciprocal recognition offered by the modern liberal state.
Precisely. In a liberal democracy, in theory, everyone is recognized as equal in dignity and rights by everyone else.
Historically, thinkers wrestled with how to handle thymos, didn't they?
They did. Socrates saw it as something potentially noble, a political virtue that needed careful cultivation and taming for the common good. Hobbes and Locke, on the other hand, saw pride as the source of conflict and tried to suppress it entirely from politics, aiming to create the bourgeois individual focused only on security and material comfort.
Which leads to Nietzsche's famous critique of the bourgeois as men without chests, individuals lacking that spirited, proud self-assertiveness that Nietzsche felt was essential to a full human life.
Exactly, and the book raises the question, even with universal legal recognition, does liberal society still need these irrational forms of recognition?
Like,
Pride in your nation, your local community, your family, maybe even religion or ethnicity to function effectively and keep people engaged and willing to sacrifice.
that's interesting.
The success of the work ethic in some Asian countries, often sustained by group identity and recognition within the family or company, rather than just individual financial gain, is noted here as a possible example.
And you can see thymos playing out in contemporary issues too, the book argues.
Absolutely. Things like the abortion debate are framed as contests over recognition, the recognition of the fetus versus the woman. The pain of racism is fundamentally about a denial of recognition and dignity.
Civil rights issues too.
Civil rights, liberties, they're all framed as contests over recognition and dignity. And the book suggests this desire for recognition was even a factor in the collapse of communism.
How so?
It cites Havel's observations on the moral compromises people made, the sort of empty rituals they performed, and the quiet dignity of dissidents living within the truth. It wasn't just about economics, it was about the humiliation, the lack of recognition. Demands for historical truth, like admitting the Caton murders, were also about recognizing past wrongs.
And this struggle for recognition provides powerful insight into international relations as well, right? Imperialism, nationalism.
Definitely. The desire for recognition isn't limited to individuals. It can manifest between states, driving imperialism, quest for world empire, and especially nationalism. Nationalism, the book argues, is a modern, powerful vehicle for this struggle. However, it's also seen as fundamentally irrational compared to the basic human-non-human distinctions, as it's based on arbitrary historical or cultural differences rather than something inherent in nature.
Okay, so bringing these two engines together now, the mechanism and thymos, how do they interact, particularly in international relations and across different cultures?
Well, the book introduces this concept of a world divided between a post-historical part and a part still stuck in history.
Okay, what does that mean?
The post-historical world is largely the sphere of established liberal democracies. Here, economic focus tends to prevail, and nationalism, while it exists, has become more private or cultural, less about state expansion.
Yeah, the part still stuck in history.
That's where traditional power politics, unresolved ideological struggles, and basic conflicts over recognition still dominate. And the book warns that collision points, perhaps over resources like oil, are a potential danger between these two worlds.
Nationalism is revisited here too, isn't it, as a form of thymos?
Yes, seen as a powerful form that emerged after earlier forms of political legitimacy, like religion or monarchy, declined. The book contrasts the aggressive, expansionist nationalism of the past with a more recent trend it calls Turkification, a focus on consolidating power and identity within a national homeland, being less interested in ruling over others.
Interesting comparison.
And the argument is made that just as liberalism successfully moved religion out of the central political sphere in Europe, largely relegating it to private belief, nationalism might follow a similar path in post-historical societies. It could become more a matter of cultural pride than aggressive state policy.
The interaction between culture and religion with modernization and liberalism is also critical here, sometimes helping, sometimes hindering.
Exactly. The book looks at examples where traditional cultural elements actually facilitated modernization and the adoption of Western practices. Think of the strong work ethic in Meiji Japan, which was rooted in traditional values, or perhaps the role of Protestantism in fostering early capitalism.
But conversely, other traditions are presented as potential obstacles.
Right, such as aspects of Hinduism's caste system and views on poverty potentially leading to social inertia, or Islamic fundamentalism being seen as a forceful reassertion of values against what are perceived as poorly grafted Western imports. It's complex.
And the persistence of the work ethic, even when its original spiritual roots might be gone.
It suggested that this is often sustained by the desire for recognition within groups, family, company, nation. This highlights that economic behavior isn't purely driven by rational self-interest, but also by these deep-seated needs for recognition.
Which raises a key point the book makes: the potential for an illiberal and non-democratic alternative to liberal democracy, particularly suggested as a possibility in Asia.
Yes, this idea of an alternative that could combine technocratic efficiency and economic rationalism with a more paternalistic, authoritarian political system. This becomes especially plausible, the book suggests, if Western liberal societies appear to be struggling with social breakdown or economic problems.
And figures like Lee Kuan Yew or Shintaro Ishihara are mentioned as voices who suggested Western liberalism might be irrelevant or unsuitable for Asian societies, preferring an approach prioritizing order, community, and development over individual liberties.
Right. It's presented as a potential challenge or alternative path.
Which leads us to the final, crucial section, where the book circles back to the core question. Is liberal democracy truly satisfying? Is it free from internal contradictions that could eventually destabilize it? Or is it genuinely the end of history?
Yeah, this is where the critiques come in. From the left, the argument is that universal and reciprocal recognition isn't actually achieved in liberal capitalist societies because of economic inequality. Capitalism's inherent disparities mean that while people may have equal legal rights, they don't have equal social standing or, crucially, equal recognition.
And the book also notes how the principle of equality keeps getting extended, right, beyond just traditional groups.
Exactly. From addressing racism, sexism, and homophobia as issues of recognition, it moves towards challenging hierarchies between humans and the rest of nature, like in environmentalism and animal rights. And this extension, particularly in a relativist age where the basis for unique human dignity is questioned, can make it difficult to rationally defend why human life or dignity is uniquely valuable.
The book even mentions lookism, inequality based on appearance.
Yes, as an example of how pervasive and sometimes arbitrary forms of inequality and the demand for recognition against them can become.
But perhaps the more fundamental critique, drawing heavily from Nietzsche, comes from the right.
Right. This view argues the problem isn't that equal recognition is incomplete, but that the goal of equal recognition itself is fundamentally flawed. Nietzsche believed this denial of natural human inequality leads to the last man.
Describe the last man.
The comfortable, complacent individual who has lost their thymos, who lacks dignity in their own eyes, reduced to being composed solely of desire and reason. These are the men without chests.
And what are the symptoms of this last man society?
Well, they're described as a focus on seeking petty, trivial pleasures, a sense of isolation despite societal connection. Tocqueville observed this early on, and a bewildering, often directionless search for meaning or values beyond liberalism itself.
And the relativism point comes back here, too.
Yes. If a society embraces relativism and loses a rational basis for unique human dignity, then arguments for extending equal rights to, say, baby seals, or even, the book provocatively suggests, HIV viruses, become logically hard to refute within that framework.
So where does thymos go in these liberal democracies? Does it just disappear, or does it find other outlets?
The book suggests it finds outlets that might prevent it from becoming destructive, things like business competition, politics, sports. The World Cup is mentioned as a huge global outlet for nationalist feeling, even if it's mostly symbolic.
High-risk leisure activities, too.
Yeah, things like extreme sports. They're seen as channels for the desire for recognition, for challenge, for proving oneself, and it's argued that some degree of nationalism and pride is likely still necessary for communities to function, to inspire sacrifice, because pure liberal self-preservation or concern for property might not be enough to motivate people to die for their country or community.
That's a powerful point.
And the book reflects on the state of post-historical societies, like much of Europe in the 1980s when it was written, noting they might seem to lack a yearning for great struggle, sacrifice, or a grand purpose, appearing perhaps content, even maybe a bit bored with their comfortable condition.
This brings us to that compelling analogy the book uses towards the end, the wagon train.
Yes. Nations are like wagons, all potentially heading towards the same endpoint of liberal democracy and market economics. But they're traveling at different speeds, facing different terrain. Some wagons have arrived, others are stalled, some have been left behind, some have lost their way entirely, and crucially, a few have deliberately chosen to stop or even turn off the path, seeking alternative routes.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the end of history, we've journeyed through the book's central arguments, the mechanism of science and economics pushing societies towards modernization and markets.
And the struggle for recognition, themos, driving that fundamental human desire for dignity and reciprocal recognition.
The book suggests these forces together point towards liberal democracy as a powerful, potentially final destination for human societies. But we've also grappled with the significant critiques and potential tensions within this vision. Questions about whether liberal democracy truly fulfills thymos, the possibility of discontent arising from mere comfort and equality, and the challenges posed by relativism and the struggle to define human dignity.
Which really leaves us with a thought-provoking question to consider, doesn't it? Is the end of history, in the sense of fundamental ideological struggle, truly here? Or does the inherent human desire for recognition, that potential for discontent with mere comfort, the yearning for something to strive for or even sacrifice for, mean that history, in that larger Hegelian sense, is bound to continue?
Yeah. As you look around the world today, can you see the mechanism still at work, shaping societies through economic development? And can you see the struggle for recognition playing out in contemporary debates and movements, whether they're about civil rights, identity, national pride, or even individual achievement? Consider whether the tensions the book describes, the critique about inequality or the concern about the last man, resonate with the challenges you see facing liberal societies today. Is history over, or simply taking a complex, maybe unexpected turn?